Let me, ladies and gentlemen, even though I can't see your faces, let me welcome you to a special evening lecture event of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. We're really very fortunate tonight to have with us Professor Jeffrey Gurock from Yeshiva University. I'm going to take a minute or two to introduce Professor Gurock, who I've really known for quite a long time, and he's pretty much anyone in the field of American Jewish history either knows Jeffrey personally or by his work, which is pretty to say pretty substantial is an understatement. Before I do that, let me just welcome um, everyone who's here on what in Jewish we would call Erev spring break. I know all the students are already rushing to make their connections to go to Florida. So I guess, people running to Florida is another Jewish connection here we can chalk up to this evening's events. I want to give a special welcome to the sports journalism and journalism students. I hope there are some out there. We had originally wanted to bring Dr. Gurock in, but it didn't work out. And anyway, I understand there's some sort of big game tonight. But I'm glad you're here to learn about the most important voice in New York sports journalism for a couple of decades, Marty Glickman. And so let me just introduce our speaker. Professor Jeffrey Gurock is the Libby Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. For those of you who are not from the New York area, that's in the Upper West side of Washington Heights of Manhattan. Professor Gurock is the author or editor of 24 books and the recipient of many awards, including the Saul Weiner Award from the American Jewish Historical Society and the Everett Family Foundation Prize for Best Book in Jewish History. He served for 20 years as the editor of American Jewish History, which is the premier journal in the field. I might say for some of those years, he served with my own mentor, Mark Lee Raphael. Professor Gurock was honored for his academic leadership with the Lee Max Friedman Medal from the American Jewish Historical Society. And in 2017, a special issue of American Jewish History was dedicated to his works. I might add his walking tours of Jewish Harlem are absolutely legendary. And he wrote one of his early works, When Harlem Was Jewish, has been totally rewritten and is available. And Professor Gurock is also now wants everybody to know that if anybody would like a signed copy of Marty Glickman, they can just write him, write or directly or through me. I'm very honored to do this, or we'll put up a book discount in the chat, or Trice will, or Jeff will. And we're just really glad to have Professor Jeffrey Gurock speaking tonight on Marty Glickman, the trials and triumphs of an American Jewish sports legend. So without further ado, Professor Gurock.
Thank you, Aaron. Of course, if they want me to sign the book, they got to buy the book, which is available at Amazon and also my press. And Professor Levinson will talk about make you know about the discount. So if this was a New York audience, and obviously it's not, I would regale the listeners and viewers with what Marty Glickman meant to me as a boy growing up in New York City, particular era of New York sports. I'm 74 years old, and Marty Glickman was the voice of my youth growing up. Just a few examples. Marty Glickman was the broadcaster for the football Giants, for the Knicks. He did 2,000 games. He did college basketball. He did roller derby. He did wrestling, so many things. And when Marty Glickman spoke, we listened. So, for example, at one point, there was a very close game for the football Giants. And Marty Glickman said to the audience, if wherever you are, in a tenement or in an apartment, go to the window, open the window, and yell out, "Go Giants, go." If you saw the movie Network, you might recall that Howard Beale opens the window and screams, "I'm mad as hell and I can't take it anymore." So as a kid, I went to the window, opened it up, and started screaming, "Go Giants, go! Go Giants, go!" So my father says to me, "What in the world are you doing?" I said, "Marty Glickman told us to yell, 'Go Giants, go! Go Giants, go!'" Another example, another great game the Giants are playing against the Minnesota Vikings. He's broadcasting, and the game is very close. If you know football, and University of Oklahoma people know football, 2-minute warning. Glickman says, "If you're within the sound of my voice, pull off the road. I don't want to cause any accidents." And a friend of mine was driving on one of the parkways in New York, and he saw cars pulling off the road. And I thought for a long time that my friend had made this up until I found a number of literary sources. For example, Mike Burke, who was at one point the president of the New York Yankees, says, "I was driving on this highway, and Glickman said, 'Pull off the road,' and I pulled off the road." And then I interviewed someone who broadcasted for the Yankees years later, Dave Cohen. He said, "I was in Brooklyn and Flatbush Avenue, bumper to bumper, and Glickman told us what to do. We pulled off the road." So Glickman was very powerful in terms of his impact upon us as sports fans. At night games, I was one of thousands of kids who would listen to Marty Glickman with our little transistor radios under the covers to hear Marty Glickman's reportage of the game. When we played basketball in the streets, if I made a good shot, I would say "swish," because Marty Glickman said "swish." Now, today in New York, you have Clyde Frazier. He says "swishing." He got that idea from Marty Glickman. If you played sandlot football and you ran for 2 or 3 yards, you'd emulate what Marty Glickman was all about. There was an Orthodox Jew who was a writer for the New York Post, one of our tabloids. His name was Vic Ziegel, and he had a problem because Marty Glickman was broadcasting St. John's basketball games. And his dilemma was, how could I, as an Orthodox Jew, root for St. John's, a Irish Catholic school? But if Marty Glickman was broadcasting the game, I will do it. So whenever I speak to New York audiences, I talk about all these things that people remember growing up. There's also a legacy of Marty Glickman. Many of the great broadcasters today, like Bob Costas and Marv Alpert and Iron Eagle and Len Berman and Dick Stockton, they're all disciples of Marty Glickman. In fact, in addition to that, 2 of the first women broadcasters nationally were disciples of Marty Glickman. Gail Serens, who did the first NFL game as a broadcaster, female broadcaster. And just 2 nights ago, I listened when Beth Mowins, they all went, by the way, to the hotbed of sports broadcasting, and that's Syracuse University, which was Marty Glickman's alma mater. So that is the extent that I'm going to talk about as far as Marty Glickman as a broadcaster. But I got to tell you, my book and my work is not about great Jewish sports heroes, glorifying Jewish athletes, or glorifying Jewish broadcasters. I'm a historian. Professor Levinson was kind enough to mention that I've written any number of books. I've written about New York. I've written about Orthodox Jews in America. But I love writing about sports because I want to elevate the study of sports beyond the pale of just talking about wins and losses. This Glickman book is my third foray into, I'm calling, the professionalization of sports as a metaphor for studying American Jewish history. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Judaism's Encounter with American Sports, how a foreign cultural phenomenon like sports enters into the lives of Jews and all the problems of being a Jew and parents and kids, intergenerational conflict through the metaphor of sports. And then I did a series of essays, which became a book called Constant Challenge, case studies of the reconciliation of sports and Judaism. So I've been at this business here as a historian for 48 years. I started teaching as a child. Okay, I was 26 when I first started. But to be honest with you, it took a lot of courage to some extent to choose to write about Jews and sports, because how should I put it? People in our field are often very dismissive of the study of sports. And it took me 25 years in the business to have the guts, the moxie, to start writing about sports as a significant aspect of Jewish life in America. But I feel that it's very important to study how Jews who come to America, how they eat, and colleagues write about Jews and food, how they dress, and people write about how Jews dress, men and women, and how they play, the basic aspect of how they adjust to America. So in my work, I often address intergenerational conflict between parents and kids through the metaphor of sports. A few years ago, and I've talked about this all over the country, really all over the world. A few years ago, I was speaking in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and during the Q&A, an elderly gentleman got up, very tall fellow. He said, I want to tell you a story. Had he told me the story before the book came out, I would have used it. He said, my father was an East European rabbi who came to America and ended up in Pittsburgh. This is in the 1930s, before there were any Jewish day schools or yeshivas in Pittsburgh. And he was not Americanized, but he had to send me to the local high school, Taylor Alderdice High School. And if you're a sports reporter, you should know, to this day, Taylor Alderdice is one of the best teams, high school teams in the country. And he goes out for the basketball team, and he makes the basketball team, but he's got a problem. The team practices 4 days a week, and they play their games on Friday. But he made an agreement with his mother that he'd be on the team, but he'd get home before the Sabbath starts. And for traditional Jews, in December and January, the Sabbath starts 4:15, 4:30, 4:45. So you know what happens. He plays one of the games, and it goes into triple overtime. And he gets home late, and the Sabbath has begun. And his father's very angry that he's violating the Sabbath by playing basketball, intergenerational conflict, right? So after his father calms down, he turns to the young man and says, oh, by the way, who won the game? Did you win? And this gentleman said this is the first indication that his father, who was a robust East European rabbi, was Americanized enough to say who won the game. Another piece to the story. Probably the greatest Yiddish journalist. And I promise you, we'll get to Marty Glickman soon, because Marty Glickman is very important as we go through this discussion of Judaism and sports. Probably the most famous Yiddish journalist of the early 20th century was the editor of the Yiddish Daily Forward named Abraham Kahan. He's also the original Jewish Dear Abby, or Ann Landers. He had a column called A Bintel Brief, where Jews wrote letters to him asking them about adjustment problems in the United States. And there's one great letter that's in one of my books. A Jew writes to Kahan as if he's writing to a rabbi asking for permission. He says, my son is crazy about baseball. Is it permissible for a Jewish boy to play baseball? So Kahan writes back, it's a great line. He says, in the best of all possible worlds, Jews should play chess, not play sports. But baseball is the national pastime. The president of the United States is an athlete. Remember pictures of Teddy Roosevelt in 1900, president of the United States, stripped to the waist. I'm not doing it literally, but with his fists up. Baseball's okay. But the other thing about Kahan was he was so ahead of his time. He says, I'm not sure about football for Jewish kids. And you know, if you follow football today, you know there's a big problem with, I forget the initials, with the injury, the mental injuries that occur because these guys are so big and so fast and they get injured and they die young. When I did the book, I wanted to interview two of the color commentators, Sam Huff and Dave Herman. Both of them were great football players. I couldn't interview them because they died. So Kahan was way ahead of his time. As a Jewish historian, we understand that in Jewish tradition, the paradigmatic Jewish male is Yaakov, is Jacob. Now, it's true that in the Bible, Jacob has a sports story. He wrestles with an angel in the book of Genesis. But our Jewish tradition says in Hebrew, he's Yoshev Ohalim, which means in English, he stands by the sideline, as opposed to his brother Esav, and Jewish tradition says he's the man of the fields. So let's talk in sports terms. He's the great right fielder who's on steroids. That's how Jewish tradition looks at sports. And yet, one of my books, and Professor Levinson was kind enough to mention that it won an award, was a biography of Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, the most controversial Jewish religious figure in the 20th century. And he's the progenitor of the idea of creating Jewish centers, synagogue centers, with the idea that maybe we can bring young men and young women into the synagogue through their interest in sports. The idea is to bring people into the sanctuary, and Christians have the same problem, by the way, except Jews are a minority group. If we create a situation where you come to play, you play the piano, art room, obviously music room, pool, and gym, maybe they'll stay to pray. So I was just teaching this in my seminar yesterday to my students who are rabbis, and I told them any rabbi in America who uses the idea that we can use sports to bring people into Jewish life is either explicitly or implicitly teaching Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan's Torah, so to speak. So there's a lot to say about the use of sports as far as understanding Jewish life is concerned. But let me finally, after 20 minutes of giving you some background on the use of sports, turn to my central theme, what the sports experience tells us about levels of acceptance of minority groups, both historically and today. And to begin, let me just say that I got this idea some 50 years ago when I was a student at Columbia University, and I was privileged to study African American history with one of the great African American scholars, Nathan I. Huggins. And he used to say all the time that for minority groups, wars and sports are community defining situations. If you want to know how a minority group is doing in the world or in a country or in a town, see if they're allowed to play for their team, for their club, for their town or their country, and or fight for their country. And of course, as an African American, 1947, when Jack Roosevelt Robinson's allowed to play Major League Baseball, it's been argued by a number of historians correctly, that's the beginning of the civil rights movement. 2 years before, Harry S. Truman desegregates the armed forces. So keep in mind, wars and sports are community-defining situations. And now we get to Marty Glickman, the story of Marty Glickman. Through Marty Glickman, we see many of these aspects of Jewish life in the first third and the second third of the 20th century played out through his personal experience. So let me begin. He's the son of immigrants. He's a second generation Jew. His family came from Romania. Interestingly enough, his father was also an athlete in Romania. So this is an unusual family because the family was interested in sports. Most families were not interested in sports. So until 1936, until the Berlin Games, Hitler's games in Berlin, he lives a charmed life. Around him in the country, there's all sorts of anti-Semitism, but he's living he lives in an ethnic cocoon. He lives in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, in a neighborhood which has Irish, Germans, Italians, and Jews who seemingly get along. No African Americans or Latinos, because our city of New York was a segregated city, de facto, not de jure. And he lives a Jewish life. They have a kosher style kitchen, which means and people study eating patterns. So I studied it too. He lives in the same building with his grandparents. His home has kosher food. They don't have pork chops, or they have shellfish, but they use the same set of dishes. My friends, I'm looking at the nature of the mediation between eating kosher and non-kosher. If he wants a real kosher meal, he goes next door to his grandparents. They have a strictly kosher home. So people who are interested in eating patterns, this is Marty Glickman. He goes to James Madison High School in Brooklyn. It is a predominantly Jewish school, and he is a terrific athlete. He's on the basketball team. He's on the football team. But most importantly, he's a great runner. And he has a dream that in 1936, he's going to go and compete in the Olympics. He is the captain of the team. And at the end of a senior year, or middle of a senior year, the team is so good, this is James Madison, that they play against the Erasmus Hall team that's led by another Jewish athlete named Sid Luckman, who later on became a professional quarterback. And they played the championship game in Ebbets Field of blessed memory. Ebbets Field was the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers before they went off to California and ruined the life of people in Brooklyn. And they played in front of 20,000 fans. And the game was not televised, but recorded, and all over the country, perhaps in movie theaters in Oklahoma, you could see films of that particular game. And if you go on YouTube, you can watch that game. He's a great athlete. So far, so good. Living in a Jewish neighborhood, going to a predominantly Jewish school, and glorified for his achievements. Now there's a question of where he goes to college. And now we get into the issue of Jews and college during the interwar period. He's so good as an athlete that 14 schools want him to enroll in that school, notwithstanding the fact that many of these schools have quotas against Jews. He ends up going to Syracuse University. Why? Because a group of Jewish fraternity brothers from the SAM, the Samis they're called, the Jewish fraternity, have this quixotic idea that if they bring a great Jewish athlete to Syracuse, this will mitigate the anti-Semitism on campus and make life better for all Jews on campus and make it possible for more Jews to attend the school. As it turns out, Marty Glickman does go to Syracuse. He does very well. The community definition for him as a sportsman, he's in. In fact, I think it's a hilarious story. One night, he's at the training table and he's about to eat the entree. He thinks it's lamb chops, but it's not lamb chops, it's pork chops. Now, nobody secreted put in those those pork chops, but he eats the pork chops, and he's very comfortable living and working and playing among his own kind, other athletes. Listen, guys and gals, At the next table, over the other table, there's another table. It's a segregated table where the African American athletes participate. You get the picture? Jews are in, African Americans are not in. So he's treated very well, and he brings honor to the school, but it gives you a sense of where Jews are in the mind of universities at that particular point in time. So I'm using the sports metaphor to engage the question dealing with the issue of discrimination against Jews and others in higher education. And then he goes to Germany. He makes the Olympic team. He goes to Germany, and he's treated in the beginning as an equal among his teammates. When he walks into the Olympic Village, he sees Nazi guards. He knows Yiddish. He speaks Yiddish to these guards. They answer him in German. They salute him. They salute him. He salutes them. He's accepted. I have pictures of him in the book of him at the training table again with Glenn Cunningham and other great runners. And then at one point, he and another Jewish athlete named Herman Goldberg, who you never heard of, who was a catcher on the American baseball team. The baseball was not an Olympic sport, but it was an exhibition sport that was played in Berlin. And Goldberg is the catcher on the team. And the newspaper reports say that the game was so boring for the fans that by the time the game was over, many of the fans had left the stadium. So Herman Goldberg and Glickman hitch a ride to go to the Olympic Stadium to watch some events. And they hitchhike, and they're picked up by a lieutenant in the Wehrmacht in the German army. And he's thrilled that he has these two American athletes in his car. And they chat about sports. When they get to the stadium, the lieutenant is so pleased to have had them that he asked for their autographs. So they quickly scribble Glickman and Goldberg because they didn't want to indicate they were Jews. Ladies and gentlemen, everything is going great for these guys, and for Glickman, of course, until what he calls the meeting. And here's where the story turns dark and bleak, okay? A day before the race, he is supposed to be in the last race in the Olympics. It's a 4x100 meter relay race in the Olympic Stadium in front of 80,000 fans, including Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, and Joseph Goebbels, and others. A day before the race, the Olympic coaches, the track team coaches come in and they say, we heard a rumor that the Germans have been hiding some great runners. Therefore, we have to use our best runners. So Glickman and Sam Stoller, a forgotten name, but also a Jewish runner, you're out. Ralph Metcalf and Jesse Owens, you'll replace him. By the way, Mac Robinson was also on that team. He has a brother named Jackie Robinson, who would later on become so famous. To his credit, Jesse Owens jumps up and says, hey, wait a minute, I've got 3 gold medals. I don't need a 4th. They tell him, boy, sit down. Glickman and Stoller don't get a chance to run. Who's behind this? His name is Avery Brundage. Don't forget his name. Avery Brundage is the president of the American Olympic Committee. He's a friend of the Nazis. He's also an industrialist, and he makes some deals with the Nazis. He doesn't want to embarrass Adolf Hitler, so these Jewish runners don't get a chance to compete. Now, I want you all to know, the 22 people who are listening to this, okay? Fast forward 36 years to 1972. The Olympics returned to Germany, not to Berlin, but to Munich. And as I hope you remember, 11 Israeli athletes are murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And after one day of mourning, mourning, Avery Brundage, same guy, Avery Brundage, says the games must go on. So wars and sports defining community. Jews and Israel are on the way out. And if you think this is only a Jewish story, there is a great writer named David Marinis who sells more books than me. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He did books on the Obamas and on the Bushes. He did a book called Path Lit by Lighting about the great Native American runner who is also kept off the Jim Thorpe. 1912 Olympics in Stockholm. Thorpe wins gold medals. He's stripped of those gold medals, and one of the instigators of the stripping, because he's accused, perhaps correctly, of making a few bucks doing playing semi-pro baseball. Who's involved? The young Avery Brundage. So this is an Oklahoma crowd. Jim Thorpe's one of your guys. It's not just a Jewish story. By the way, there is a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Race, which documents the life of Jesse Owens. And they have the story all wrong, because the way they tell the story is after the race, you have Stoller and Glickman coming out of the stands and jumping up and down with Jesse Owens, and they all chant, USA, USA. This didn't happen. Stoller and Glickman stood alone. And not only that, the American newspapers and the American Jewish newspapers don't emphasize this. They're more caught up with the success of the American Olympic team and the fact that Avery Brundage goes after a woman swimmer who breaks the code of conduct by having a cocktail party on the boat to Germany. They are marginalized, and they feel very strong. They stand alone. So I want everybody to remember Avery Brundage. Very important. After the race, after the Olympics, and here the story gets a little more personal. Glickman comes back to New York, and he wants to work out at the New York Athletic Club, which is this great wasp preserve on 59th Street, south of Central Park. And he gets to the door, and he's turned away. And Glickman says, "Hey, I'm an American Olympic athlete." They say to him, "You're a Jew. No Jews are allowed in the New York Athletic Club." This is a good example of the social anti-Semitism that Jews faced during this time period. And I want to tell a personal anecdote that's not in the book. My father, Jack Gurock, who wrestled under an assumed name because he didn't want his mother to know he was becoming a bum and being a wrestler, he wrestled for the 92nd Street YMHA, the Jewish Settlement House. And they had a meet. They wrestled against the New York Athletic Club. We had in our home what we called the purloined towel. My father stole the towel on the way out. That's as close as he got, as a Jew got during this time period. Late in his life, Marty Glickman was cajoled by the New York AC once they opened the gates to Jews and blacks and women to speak there. And he did speak. He refused to become a member, and he told the story of his exclusion. Wars and sports define community. Once again, Marty Glickman is on the outside looking in. But there's more to Glickman's story. One last important piece. I started by saying that Glickman, for us, was the great New York broadcaster. His dream was to be a nationally recognized broadcaster, to do the game of the week, to be this national personality. But to do that, he's pressured to change his name from Marty Glickman to Marty Manning. I wonder if anyone in my audience that I can't see, but I hope you're there, know who Isur Danilovich is. That's Kirk Douglas. He's one of the Jews who changes his name in order to be accepted during that time period. And the other problem that Marty Glickman has is that he sounds like me, a New York Jew. And the feeling was that America didn't want to listen to a New York Jewish voice on the airwaves. So he never gets a chance to do that. You know, the saddest part of that story, ladies and gentlemen, is that when professional basketball began right after the war, the original incarnation of the NBA was an organization known as the BAA, Basketball Association of America. And the president of the organization was a man named Maurice Podoloff. And the publicist for the BAA was Haskell Cohen. They had two little offices in the Empire State Building. They didn't want Glickman to be the announcer because they felt the game would be seen as too Jewish. This is an example of Jews being intimidated, Jews not fitting in, and the instigators of this were Jews themselves. Similar things go on, by the way, on TV and in the movies where name changes were fostered. In the book, I talk about the fact that Marty Glickman doesn't change his name, and there's a woman who lives in the Bronx. Her name is Bess Myerson, who was pressured to change her name. And she stood up and said, I'm not going to change my name. People won't know who I am. And in 1947, she becomes the one and only Jew to become Miss America. Wars and sports define community. The funny thing is, or the ironic thing is, that 50 years later, Marty Glickman is called upon by the National Broadcasting Corporation to tutor former athletes to be broadcasters. One of them was Bob Greasy, Miami Dolphins. One of them was Frank Gifford, who did the New York Giants, and many more. So Glickman was more of a gentleman than I am. He never said that, 50 years ago, I couldn't broadcast. Now you're calling upon me to be a teacher to the next generation. Certain irony. As I speak to you, right out my window, I can see Fordham University, a Catholic college. In the last years of Marty Glickman's life, he was called upon to teach sports broadcasting at Fordham University. And some of the local broadcasters today, one of the guys who he mentored, again, I'm talking in Oklahoma, was a fellow named Sal Marciano, a proud Italian American who lived in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn. And he too was pressured to change his name, and he refused. And then when he became famous, he met his boyhood hero, Frank Sinatra, who said, I'm so proud that you didn't change your name to make it in America. Another indication of the way things were back then and how things changed. Glickman referred to Podoloff and to Cohen as Jewish anti-Semites. Jew can't be an anti-Semite. Perhaps we're talking about people who were intimidated and maybe self-hating Jews. Two last stories that I want to tell you. One is about Bob Costas, who's not Jewish, but one of Glickman's disciples. In 2012, 40 years after the murder of Israeli athletes, the Jewish community of London, that's where the Olympics were held, and the Israeli national team wanted to have the Olympic acknowledge what had happened 40 years earlier. So remember, the IOC has never been favorably disposed towards Israel. And permit me to say there's another organization out there which hasn't been particularly supportive of Israel. It's called the United Nations. A year after Brundage says the games must go on, the UN defines Zionism as racism. So keep that in mind as well. In any event, Costas is going to anchor the opening ceremonies, but the IOC not wanting to let this commemoration go on and concerned how it would play on the Arab street, if you will, the Muslim street, they say no. As the Israeli national team marches in, Costas goes off his script and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to know who these people are and what happened to them." It's a 10 or 15-second soundbite. And then NBC went to a commercial. So I write in the book that Glickman was dead 11 years by the time this happened. But I think he would have been very proud that one of his guys, who wasn't a Jew, stood up for the Jewish people. 1972, in his own recollections, was a searing moment for Marty Glickman. And then in 2012, Bob Costas says the right thing. And Professor Levinson, I want to make one other point, and then if people have questions or comments. A few months before the book came out in October, I sent galleys, page proofs, to a young rabbi in Los Angeles. His name is Erez Sherman. He's now the rabbi, along with his wife, who's also a rabbi, of Temple Sinai, which is one of the biggest conservative synagogues in America. And the former rabbi is David Wolpe, another famous rabbi. And I sent him the copy of the book, and he was asked to speak to the USC, University of Southern California track team about anti-Semitism today. And he brings and this is not in my book, but it is a second edition. It will be in that book. So he takes my book with him and tells him about Glickman and tells him about the story. Why did they invite him to speak? Because this team is about to go to Auschwitz on a consciousness-raising tour. And it's very heartwarming for me that he used my book to emphasize this long history of anti-Semitism. And the final point is that not only did Avery Brundage want Glickman and Stoller not to run, but the track coach for the Olympic team, his name was Dean Cromwell, who was an anti-Semite, who was a supporter of the German-American Bund. And when I gave this speech a couple months ago, a colleague of mine said, "Did you know that University of Southern California has recently taken Dean Cromwell's name off the track stadium at USC? Because in addition to being an anti-Semite, he was also a racist." Another very, very bad guy. So the Erez Sherman story warms me and says that, with all the difficulties we're facing now, and they are legion, and it's important to note it, the fact of the matter is that this USC track club wanted to hear from a rabbi about Marty Glickman. So the book deals with triumph over adversity and deals with the life of a second-generation American Jew. And I think it's more than just his story. We can use his story. We can use sports to tell bigger stories about American Jewish life. I wish I were here to shake your hands but I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to speak virtually to you by the miracle of Zoom. And I thank Professor Levinson and Trice Hyman, who's a great guy, who made it possible for me to be here. If there are any questions or comments, I'm very anxious to talk to you. So the floor is now open for discussion, if there's any discussion at this point. I see two. Lou Goldell says he remembers Marty Glickman, and his father ran track with him in high school. Unbelievable. Yeah, well, again, James Madison was a very fine school. For New Yorkers, you should know, for Americans, you should know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Chuck Schumer, who I'm not particularly disposed towards tonight, were both graduates of James Madison High School, along with Stanley Kaplan. Stanley Kaplan became a millionaire with the SAT tutoring activity. So they were part of that activity. So thank you.
Great.
James Madison was a very fine school, and they, with much difficulty, opened up their records for me so I could profile not only Glickman, but his teammates. Ella Trumley asked, it's not an online copy. The book is called Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. It's available through Amazon or NYU Press. And if you buy through NYU Press, you can get a discount if you use the code, capital letters, 30% discount, NYUAU30, and you could buy the book. And if you like the book, send me a note and I'll send you an autographed fill-in. Okay? So thank you, Ella. Barry Roseman, can you comment on a big topic? Masculine identity in American Jewish life with respect for sports in the 20th century. When I grew up in the 70s, most of my Gentile high school classmates didn't think of Jews as being athletic, only book people. So my hero was, I guess, Mark Spitz. I can't see the bottom of your comment, but I imagine that's what you're saying. The fact of the matter is that Jews were seen in the early 20th century as prominent boxers. Okay, and in the 1930s there was a writer, an editor for the New York Daily News named Paul Gallico, who said that Jews were very proficient in basketball, some of the great basketball players, and because basketball is a sneaky sport and Jews are sneaky, and that's why they do so well in sports. But are we a book people? Absolutely. And people breaking away from their families to play sports. I was involved in a movie called The First Basket about 15 years ago about the early New York Knicks. And one of the people I interviewed who was on that team said that growing up, he didn't want his parents to know he was playing sports. And my father was that way too. But Jews were very involved in sports. And as far as Mark Spitz is concerned, you know, Mark Spitz's father could not have won 7 gold medals because Jews had great difficulty getting into swim clubs. Another example of the exclusion of Jews during that time period. So yeah, we're people of the book, but we have a long athletic history in America, which was unusual for Jews because we came from a culture where the hero is the teacher, the rabbi, not the coach. And if you think that if you come home as an immigrant child and you tell your parents that I'm listening to my coach, not my rabbi, you begin to understand some of the conflicts that ensued during that time period. Great question, Barry. Let's see. Okay. So, Lou, your father was at James Madison High School, a freshman, and Marty was a senior. Annie Magid, did Marty Glickman interact with Mel Allen? Good question. I have a picture of Mel Allen in my book. He was born Mel Allen Israel in Alabama and changed his name. Didn't change his accent. He had a southern accent, and he was the broadcaster for the Yankees. So there was an interaction between the two. Mel Allen is a good example of someone who changed his name because he wanted to fit in. Glenn Leschner, no question here, but I remember and listened to Marty Glickman while growing up in North Jersey. I did not know that Marty Glickman was a Sammy. I'm also a Sammy. Rutgers 73 to 77. Thank you, Dr. Gurock, for relaying your interesting research on a great sports broadcaster. Thank you, Glenn, very, very much. Rona Seidelman, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you. Joseph Offit, earlier mentioned football and not necessarily kosher due to the risk of what I assume you mean CTE. Yes, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. My question is, do Jewish leaders make the connection between repeated concussions and lasting brain injury? No, not directly, but what I said in the lecture was that Kahan was very concerned about people being injured playing football. And remember, back then they wore leather helmets and they didn't have face guards. I don't think he was worried about CTE. Thank you for reminding me of that illness. And hey, listen, it's a problem for football today. In college, I played lacrosse, which is the fastest growing sport in America, because a lot of families don't want their kids playing football because of the possibility of injury. So thank you, Joseph, for your comment. So that's what I have as far as comments are concerned. And I wish I was here to shake your hands, but let me tell you that it's a pleasure to speak to you. And I hope you pick up the book and learn more about Marty Glickman and about Jews and sports. And thank you for inviting me. I think
It was great having you,
okay.
Professor
So,
Gurock.
okay. So that's
Thank you.
thank you very much, and be well. Okay.
Thank you. Be well.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And we will have a couple of just lunches in April and May. And Tricer I will surely get in contact with you about them. So thank you very much for coming tonight.